I'm Michael Kuzma, Senior Legislative Assistant to Councilmember David A. Franczyk. Today we're going to try something different. We're going to interview Bruce L. Beyer, a resident of the Fillmore District. Bruce has played an important part in the history of not only the Fillmore District, but the city of Buffalo. And I'd like to thank and welcome Bruce for being on the show today.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
Before we proceed, could you tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I was born and raised in Buffalo. I went to high school here, went to Bennett, and this would have been 1965, graduated. Shortly thereafter, I went to college. I was studying forestry at a place called Paul Smith's, and the war was raging in Vietnam, or was beginning to rage in Vietnam, and I got involved in anti-war movement activities. And
Paul Smith College, that's at Saranac Lake?
Yes.
Was there much of an anti-war movement in that neck of the woods,
Absolutely
or that part of the
none.
state?
Absolutely none. I came home after my freshman year and got involved with an organization called the Vietnam Summer Campaign, which was a group of young people traveling around the country trying to educate college students about what was happening in Vietnam. And I got involved with them, started to learn about Vietnam, and got to the point where I realized I wasn't going to head back to school the following year, and I was going to be involved in anti-war organizing. My objections to the war at that point, which would have been 1966, were based primarily on moral grounds, in that I didn't feel that any Vietnamese person was threatening me, and that I had no reason to go to Vietnam to kill anybody. And I applied for a conscientious objector status in the military and was denied. In that I was denied by the draft board, in that I was not a member of an historical peace church like the Mennonites or the Quakers. And no, that's
So you applied for that status in 1966?
1967.
67,
66.
and you stayed in Buffalo. You didn't go
I
back
did.
to Saranac Lake.
Yes, no, I stayed here. And I became aware that if drafted, one didn't have to go, that you could say no, which was a revelation for me, because we all felt compelled by the government to do what we were told to do. And a friend came along and said, well, you don't have to do that. You could just say no. And that concept really intrigued me. And so in October of 1967, I traveled down to Washington, D.C., and returned my draft card to the Justice Department at a demonstration that took place on the 20th of October. There were, on the stairs of the Justice Department was Dr. Benjamin Spock, a friend of mine from Buffalo, Michael Ferber, and a couple other folks, and about 60 of us, 70 of us went up and turned our draft cards in. The reason for turning them in as opposed to burning them, which was going on a lot in those days, was that we wanted to give evidence to the Justice Department to show that we were saying no. That simply burning a draft card, while it certainly showed opposition, really didn't matter. But by turning the card into the Justice Department, we were in our minds anyway, we were giving the Department of Justice grounds to come after us, because we were inviting them to come after us. In that it was against the law to not have a draft card in your possession in those days. You were obliged to keep your draft board informed of what you were doing, whether you were in school, not in school, things like that. So I turned my draft card in, and Ferber and Spock went into the Justice Department offices and went up to the office of the United States Attorney General, who at the time was Ramsey Clark, and turned in the cards to Clark and said, here you go. The next day was one of the largest anti-war mobilization demonstrations in the history of the United States at the Pentagon. It's when the rock band The Fugs tried to levitate the Pentagon. We managed to get it a couple inches off the ground, but it was pretty weighty and fell back down. Came back to Buffalo, and shortly thereafter received an order to report for induction. And I went down. The induction center at that point was located at Main and North, or Main and Summer, I can't remember. And turned my I went into the building to report for induction. When they told people to stand up and step forward to take the pledge, I said no, sat down, and they simply told me to go home. I received another order to report for induction. Same thing happened. Another order to report for induction. I went down this time and burned the order to report for induction in front of the draft board, in front of the induction center. Then I received another order to report for induction, and this time in August of 1968, when I received that order to report for induction, we took sanctuary in the church. And again, it was an attempt to highlight our opposition to the war, our opposition to the draft. We knew we'd be arrested. We weren't attempting to hide from it, but we were attempting to call out the government and say, here we are, come and get us.
So if we could back up for just a minute, when Dr. Spock turned in your draft card and the other draft cards, do you know what the Justice Department or Ramsey Clark did with those cards? Were the cards ever, was your card, for example, ever returned?
My card was never returned, but I was reclassified 1A delinquent by my draft board, which meant that I moved up to the head of the list to be ordered for induction into the military. And the grounds for doing that was that I had turned in my draft card. And the draft board literally stated that in their letter to me when they reclassified me 1A delinquent.
Now, who was on the draft board at that time?
Well, Buffalo was, every community had its own draft board, and Buffalo had 10 of them. The city was divided into 10 different sections. And each board had 10 members. And for the most part, they were professional people. They were supposed to be representative of the community. But in the city of Buffalo, the draft board that oversaw the induction of African Americans into the military was all white. There were no black members. And 6 of the 10 members were funeral home directors.
Interesting.
We, of course, made direct connection to making money on the war and the burying of soldiers, for what it's worth.
Now, for people who weren't even born when this was happening, wasn't there a lottery system in place to determine who would be drafted and who wouldn't be?
Well, the lottery didn't come into effect until 1970 or 71. Prior to that, every American male turning 18 was required to register with Selective Service, and then a system of deferments was issued by the Selective Service system that allowed students deferments. If you worked in the military defense industry, you got a deferment. If you were a teacher, you got a deferment. If you were psychologically unfit for service, you got a deferment. If you were a gay soldier, a gay person, you would get deferred because they didn't want you. So lots of young men said, "Oh, I'm gay," or made up excuses. I'm crazy. I take too many drugs, whatever. So, the vast majority of young people who were eligible for the draft at that time were draft dodgers, who dodged the draft, who figured out some extra legal means to get out of the Selective Service system. Many stayed in school way beyond what they should have or would have normally, and simply to avoid being inducted.
Now, how did one register with the Selective Service system?
You simply went down to the draft board and signed a form.
It wasn't like now where the kids have to go to the post office.
No, that's the streamlined version. No, you went to your draft board and you signed a form.
So would you say that a disproportionate number of working class people and people of color were drafted during the Vietnam War?
Well, most white middle class kids went to college, and
they didn't have to serve then.
Yeah, you got the deferment. Theoretically, you'd be deferred until you were finished with school, so that meant a lot of kids went on to graduate school.
So if you were a Polish working class kid or a African-American kid on the east side, odds are you would be drafted, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the deferments.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the casualty figures in Vietnam reflect a disproportionate number of African Americans and white working class kids. To make the connection to today, it's minorities and white kids, working class kids, poor kids, who are fighting the battles that the majority of American youth are avoiding, not because there's a draft in place, but simply because they're not being asked.
Yes. Now, you decided not to go fight this unjust and immoral war. What did you end up doing? You mentioned something about the church. Could you give us a little more detail about that?
Well, at the time, all this discussion has to be seen in the context of what was going on in Vietnam and in other third world countries and in our communities in the United States, which had been racked by racial strife and the anti-war movement at the time was primarily focused on university campuses. And we were, in Buffalo, we tried to get the anti-war movement off the campuses and into the community. So we set up an organization called the Buffalo Draft Resistance Union. A group of 6 or 8 of us who had turned in our draft cards. And
where was that located?
Was in an old apartment building called the Fenton, which is located at Main and West Ferry Street.
Yes.
And we did draft counseling. In other words, we informed people of their rights under selective service. If you looked at selective service regulations, they were in a book about 2 inches thick. And there were all kinds of, if you do this, this happens. If you do that, this happens, that kind of stuff. So we were informing young men as to their rights about selective service. And I was morally opposed to the war. I didn't really have a lot of political opposition. I was opposed to killing. And that doesn't mean that and this is where I screwed up with my conscientious objector status. If I'm attacked, I would fight back, and I would defend myself, and I would defend my family, and I would defend my friends. But I didn't feel threatened by the Vietnamese people, and nobody was attacking me, so I felt there was no reason for me to go there. There was absolutely, in my mind, no justification for the killing of Vietnamese people. I listened to the arguments that we had to stop communism in its tracks, and we had to stop them before they got here and all that nonsense. But I just didn't think that the Vietnamese people had any capability of getting on a B-52 bomber and flying sorties over D.C. or San Francisco, for that matter.
Yes.
But as time changed, as time went on, and being in the situation I became more aware that there were political reasons for why we were involved in Vietnam. I listened to the speeches of Eisenhower and others about tin and tungsten and mineral riches in Vietnam and rubber. And remember at that time, that in 1954, when the French left Vietnam, the rubber plantations were huge. The rubber was needed for the manufacture of tires, let alone a lot of other things. So my thinking changed, and I became more involved in the political struggle to end the war within the context of all the society that we live in.
Stay tuned for part 2.